The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
In the last forum, we talked about how America today is making the same mistake that Neville Chamberlain made back in 1938. And Chamberlain's peace pact, as we discussed in the last forum, that pact that he made with Hitler, it maybe bought Europe a few months of relative peace, I guess you could say. But during that time, Germany, of course, was aggressively preparing for war, and then the war came, an unthinkable conflict that spread over all the earth. Theodore Roosevelt, a president back in the early 1900s, talked about how diplomacy really is useless if it's not backed by power. He said in 1897, "Diplomacy is utterly useless when there's no force behind it. The diplomat is the servant, not the master of the soldier." He says there are higher things in this life than the soft and easy enjoyment of material comfort. He said finally, "It is through strife, or the readiness for strife, that a nation can win greatness." So he thought, as did many others, that diplomacy has its place, but strong nations have to be prepared for strife. They have to be prepared to show strength. Otherwise, diplomacy is just words. I mean, nothing but words. More recently, Dr. George Friedman, who runs the Stratfor website, he wrote, "Diplomacy without a realistic threat of significant action in the event that diplomacy fails is just empty chatter." And that statement there, I think, perfectly summarizes the American foreign policy today, particularly with respect to Iran. We're just reduced to diplomats uttering a lot of meaningless chatter, really empty chatter. Last week, the White House hosted a meeting with Senate leaders to plead with lawmakers to hold off on any additional sanctions against Iran in the hope that one final round of discussions, one final round of diplomacy might prevent Iran from moving forward. This is according to Reuters from last Thursday. It says, while Congress has sought harsher sanctions on Iran, the administration wants more time to give negotiations over Iran's nuclear program a chance. The negotiations that include 6 world powers are due to resume November 7th and 8th in Geneva. So we're, I guess, a week or two away from resumption of talks. And that's what we're hoping for, the White House is anyway, trying to keep Congress from acting, from applying more sanctions in the hope that they can make some progress in those diplomatic discussions. This is one State Department spokeswoman, Jen Psaki, from last Friday, October 26th, or October 25th. She said, "We have conveyed that any congressional action should be aligned with our negotiating strategy as we move forward. So while we understand that Congress may consider new sanctions, we think this is a time for a pause," she said, "as we asked for in the past, to see if negotiations can gain traction." She said finally, "We feel that it's important that any new proposal take into account the progress we're making diplomatically and leave open the flexibility." And then she said, "There's always time for sanctions in the future as needed." There's always time to apply sanctions later, which of course isn't true. There's not always going to be time for sanctions. In fact, we're running out of time before Iran crosses that nuclear threshold. It's interesting, really, just the same day that she made that statement, October 26th, the USA Today wrote about a new report that says Iran may need as little as a month to produce enough uranium for a nuclear bomb. So even as Iran is about to cross that nuclear threshold, even as it keeps right on enriching uranium, the White House wants to give diplomacy one last chance. I mean, we're really walking a tightrope here. Now, let's assume for a moment that Iran's uranium enrichment program is, as they say, for peaceful purposes. Now, I don't believe that. I don't think any of you believe that. But assuming that's true, assuming they're building up this program to help them with medical supplies or energy or whatever it is that they need, that still doesn't erase the past 3 decades of conflict that Iran has instigated against largely the United States. Over these past 3 decades, Iran has been warring against the United States. They haven't yet used nuclear weapons because they don't yet have them, but they have been using other weapons. They have been targeting American interests. They have been killing Americans. You know how it all started back in 1979 with the attack on the U.S. Embassy, and they took 63 Americans hostage for over a year. And then that led to that Islamic Revolution in Iran, and then throughout the difficult 1980s when they were warring against Iraq and all the violence that was happening in Lebanon. In 1982, Iran formed Hezbollah, which is its terrorist proxy, situated there in Lebanon, but really Hezbollah has its tentacles spread all over the earth. And Iran continues to fund Hezbollah to this day to the tune of about $200 million per year. But going back to the 1980s, they formed Hezbollah in 1982. Hezbollah bombed the U.S. Embassy in Beirut in 1983. That killed 63 people, including 17 Americans. And then that same year, more infamously, they bombed the U.S. Marine barracks in Lebanon, killing 241 U.S. servicemen. We just passed the 30-year anniversary of that attack, by the way. 30 years on from it. In 1984, the U.S. Department of State officially declared Iran a state sponsor of terrorism. And they have been ever since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Throughout the 80s, I mentioned the war between Iran and Iraq, and the U.S. position during that decade was to side with Iraq against Iran. And during that same time, you had all of these abductions of foreign nationals, many Westerners even, most of them spearheaded by Hezbollah. All of these Westerners were being kidnapped, held for ransom, killed in some cases. That was throughout the 1980s. In 1992, Hezbollah bombed Israel's embassy in Buenos Aires, killed 29 people. 2 years later, they bombed another Jewish organization in Buenos Aires, killing 85 people. There was the Khobar Towers incident in 1996, killing 17 U.S. servicemen. That was Hezbollah-backed. Iran backed that effort. Moving forward to 2007, the U.S. Department of Treasury added Iran's Revolutionary Guard, their military arm, in Iran. They added the Revolutionary Guard to the list of foreign terrorist organizations. They were identified or labeled as a terrorist organization. In December 2009, we reported on this in the Trumpet at the time, but the now retired General David Petraeus said, Iran continues to fund, train, equip, and give some direction to the residual Shiite militias and extremist elements in Iraq. So you know about the U.S. involvement there and the resistance that we were facing, and how that who we were fighting really was Iran. We've written so much about this at the Trumpet. In any event, Petraeus went on to say there are daily attacks. This is in 2009, keep in mind. He says there are daily attacks with the so-called signature weapons only made by Iran. Okay, so they're not nuclear weapons, but lots and lots of weapons originating in Iran, turning up in Iraq, killing U.S. servicemen once again. Petraeus said the explosively formed projectile forms of improvised explosive devices, all these IEDs hidden on roads and wherever else that were blowing up U.S. convoys. In 2011, this is just a couple of years ago, Mike Mullen, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he said, Iranian-backed Shiite militias are killing our troops. They're killing U.S. troops. These Iranian-backed militias, here again, he said they were using these sophisticated weapons, IEDs, and so on. That same year, in 2011, if you remember, Iran tried to assassinate the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the United States in Washington, D.C. They tried to blow up a restaurant. It didn't work. But they had a terrorist cell in the United States that was trying to blow up a restaurant right in our nation's capital. Let me quote to you what James Mattis said in March 2012. He was the head of U.S. Central Command. He told a Senate committee that Iran poses, listen to this, Iran poses the single greatest threat to U.S. interests and to our friends and stability in the region, and poses a global threat through its worldwide proxy network, as recent attacks have demonstrated. That was said a year and a half ago. A year and a half ago, the single greatest threat to American interests in the region. That same year, the Hezbollah terrorists bombed a bus full of Israelis in Bulgaria. I think that killed 5 Jews and the bus driver as well. The attacks have continued all the way up through 2012, and then you get to May, June 2013, and in comes the hand-picked Rouhani, and all of a sudden we're supposed to view all of this history differently, I guess, judging by the media's warm embrace of this new president, this so-called moderate. They've really amplified his smooth-sounding words, as I said in the last forum, and have ignored the fruits, the actions, the works of these past 30 years. Right after he came into power, Rouhani appointed Hossein Dagan as defense minister. Dagan joined the Revolutionary Guard back in 1979, right after the revolution started. He hopped right into that terrorist organization as identified by the United States government. He served in Syria. He served in Lebanon. He was in Lebanon at the time that the Marine barracks were bombed. I think Mugniyana gave the actual order, but Dagan was right there overseeing the Revolutionary Guard in Lebanon, participating in that attack. Let's look at 1 Thessalonians 5. This is who the mullahs wanted in charge of Iran's defense forces. Now, as I said in the forum last week, history shows us that Chamberlain's form of diplomacy, it does nothing to prevent madmen from slaughtering millions of human beings if given the power, if given the weapons of mass destruction. Chamberlain's form of diplomacy does nothing to prevent those atrocities from happening. But more important than that, Bible prophecy tells us that this strategy is not going to stop the inevitable eruption of World War III. We know this is coming, and the Bible describes it in so many places. 1 Thessalonians 5:1, it says, "But of the times and of the seasons, brethren, you have no need that I write unto you." I mean, he's writing to God's people, and he's trying to inform them, Paul is, and tells them that, look, you of all people should be the most informed people on earth regarding the times and the seasons. Verse 2, he says, "For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night." See, Christ is coming back to this earth when this earth least expects it. He's coming back at an unexpected hour. That's what it means there in verse 2. And then verse 3 says, for when they, speaking of mankind, when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. See, God will suddenly intervene in the affairs of mankind, but not until catastrophe sweeps across the surface of this earth. Bible prophecy shows us, it tells us that when the commentators begin to trumpet man's successful peace efforts, successful in quotes that is, that we better look out because sudden destruction is coming. When you hear all the talk about peace, we know other prophecies speak of ambassadors for peace weeping. We've read that passage from Isaiah before in forums. Staying here in 1 Thessalonians, verse 4 says, but you, brethren, are not in darkness, that day should overtake you as a thief. See, here again, you, of all people, Paul says, are not in darkness. God's truth. I mean, it's abundant in this church, and we can know, if we'll keep our minds alert to what's happening around us and be vigilant spiritually. Study our Bibles. Verse 6 says, therefore let us not sleep as do others, but let us watch and be sober. There's a verse in 1 Corinthians 15 that says we should awake to righteousness. Here Paul says, don't sleep as others do, but be attentive, watch, and be sober. Be spiritually alert. Not drunk spiritually like so many in this world today. The Bible repeatedly refers to this end-time destruction that man's bringing upon himself. And right along with that, the Bible repeatedly refers to man's inability, not just his inability to solve the problems of this world, but his inability to even see that the destruction is on the horizon. It's incredible when you think of it, that commentators on both sides of the political persuasion can so confidently maintain that there's a solution here in man, when the Bible says there is no hope in man. As the prophet Jeremiah said, Jesus Christ compared the time that we're living in today, the days leading up to his return. He compared these days to the time just before the flood. And what happened in that history? You can go back in Genesis 6 and 7 and see for yourself. Everyone knows what happened back then. Most people disregard it. Many people don't even believe it. Many think that, I guess, Jesus was foolish for even bringing it up in Luke 17. But Christ believed in that history and warned us, using that as an example. In Matthew 24, I referred to this last time, where he talked about great tribulation coming on this earth, unlike any other tribulation period in world history. In Luke 21, he said it would be like a snare. This is the language that you just see repeated over and over again in the Scriptures. Old Testament, New Testament, the Gospels, the prophets, Jesus himself. It's coming like a snare, and it's going to catch us completely off guard. It's going to catch human civilization completely off guard. The prophet Isaiah, he compared it to the collapse of a high swelling wall whose breaking, the prophet said, whose breaking comes suddenly at an instant. That's in Isaiah 30. So all through the Bible, you read about it. You can see about it in history, as I've said. Sudden destruction. That's what Jesus Christ associates with the events that lead up to his return. And be assured, as I've noted here today, that it all unfolds at the very time, right at the very time, when most people on this earth least expect it.